Without further ado, my name is Michael Koch. I'm a director at the National Board of Trade. It's a Swedish government agency. Thank you very much, first of all, for having me here. My presentation, I will try and refocus it slightly towards a company perspective on compliance. Maybe it's a very brave thing for a bureaucrat, but try to think from the perspective of companies when all this happened. When the full-scale invasion started, we were absolutely inundated with phone calls from companies. There was this major shift for all companies who had done business with Russia and Belarus. We used to tell them that there are three things you have to take into consideration in this new situation. First of all, can you actually send your goods or services to Russia? This depended, of course, what kind of goods it was. It was relatively easy if it's good to do with goods. You can check with the customs. There is on an online service. If you know your HS code, it's relatively easy. It's slightly more difficult if it's a dual-use product. When it came to Russia, this list was suddenly expanded as well. So it was more difficult, and there were new companies that hadn't had any contact with dual-use goods that suddenly found themselves now trading in dual-use goods with Russia. So a complication, but relatively easy. The second problem they faced was, who were they now doing business with? And was that person or company listed by the EU? This turned out to be pretty tricky because soon after the invasion, Russia, they took all their registries, their company registries, offline. So it was very difficult to check this. The third problem was to try and make the financial transaction connected to the trade. So even if you have goods that you could still trade, even if you found out that probably the entity you were doing business with was not listed by the EU, you still had a huge problem, especially if you were a small or medium-sized company in Sweden, to find any Swedish bank who would like to make the transaction for you. So this was a huge obstacle for the Swedish companies. And they also faced, then, of course, trying to walk through the labyrinth of Swedish bureaucracy, because we have a number of agencies involved in this. We are one. If you have a dual-use product, you have to go to the Inspectorate for Strategic Products. If you're a bank, you're probably going to talk with the Finance Inspectorate. There is also the Social Insurance Office of Sweden and a tax authority who have some parts in the system. So it's a challenge. And of course, this is the implementation side. Enforcement, you have the customs. And if you don't watch out, maybe the police will come after you. So all this is one major injection of uncertainty into the trading system. Of course, this is what we want when it comes to sanctions. We want this uncertainty. Companies should take heed and think twice if they want to trade with Russia. And if you look at the Swedish exports, they certainly listen to the message. So you had this sharp reduction in the exports to Russia. The vertical line is the date of the full-scale invasion. Afterwards, you can see a slight hike. That's actually pharmaceuticals. For some time, we had an increase even in exports to Russia. But pharmaceuticals are allowed. Most of the trade in pharmaceuticals is done by major companies. They could sort out the problems of financial transactions. So it's not that strange. But this is the situation for the companies where they found themselves in. We have this reduction, just what we want to see. Now, this is the same kind of picture that you've seen from Åke and also from Eric and Ben in a slightly different shape. It's the blue part is the reduction, the reduced exports for Russia, from Sweden to Russia, whereas the yellow part is the sudden increase you can see after the full-scale invasion of the Swedish exports to a number of countries in the vicinity of Russia. We're painting the same picture here as Eric has painted and Åke. So, and from a company perspective, I think you should see this, that three things I mentioned here. If you look at the goods or services, well, the goods, for most of these countries, there are no restrictions. You can send the goods and services to these countries. If you look at dual use goods, that list is far more narrow when it comes to these countries. There are not the same checks in most of the EU countries. I've heard that recently the Swedish customs have actually started asking for end user certificates for some of these countries as well. But that's not sort of on an EU level. So it will be easier in that sense to export to these countries, more certain. You can also check who actually owns the company in these countries that you are doing business with. And you can also find Swedish banks who are willing and able to make the transactions for you to these countries. So this is the challenge, I think, that a lot of the uncertainty is suddenly removed when you start trading with other third countries. And you are doing that, and you're trying, I think at least, most companies are actually trying hard and trying to have agreements and user certificates with the buyers in these countries to try and make sure that the goods are not ending up in Russia. But just as Eric and others have shown, Ben as well, we have today also an increased export to Russia from these third countries. So this is the paradox in a sense, that you on a single consignment level, we often find that we have a very good paper trail. We have the necessary certificates. We have the agreements in place with the buyer in the third country. When the customs do the checks, it looks good. But then we have the data, the trade data on an aggregate level, which implies that the picture is not as rosy. But unfortunately, things are ending up. Goods that should not end up in Russia actually ends up in Russia. This is the challenge, I think, for us as an agency, and maybe this is also the challenge for the future, how we should address this. But this is my major point, the sort of gap between the paper trail and the overall statistics. This is the thing that worries us today. And I think that maybe the quote from Lars, from our PM, that just because it could be seen as being legal doesn't make it appropriate. And how do we move through this? Now, how can we do things that put more pressure on companies to think twice and make them more responsible for the exports that they are doing? So I'll stop there. Thank you.